In the quiet corners of England, where mist curls across the meadows and time seems slower, there's a sound that has haunted the human imagination for centuries. A long, trembling cry that rises through the darkness, drifts over hedgerows, and fades into the cold night air. Those who hear it say their hearts freeze, because in English folklore that cry means one thing only: someone is about to die. The creature behind this sound is the owl, specifically the barn owl, with its pale ghost-like face and dark, unblinking eyes. To modern science, it is a bird of prey. To older generations, it was a messenger from the other side. They called it the death owl, the corpse bird, the screech of doom. For centuries, the owl's eerie voice echoed across villages and churchyards, often near places of burial. People whispered that it came to announce death before it arrived, its scream a warning for those destined to lose someone they loved. It wasn't just a rural legend. In towns, too, the superstition spread. When an owl was heard hooting near a window, families would extinguish their candles, whisper prayers, and wait in dread. They believed the sound was not random. It was a prophecy, but where did this fear begin? The roots of the myth reached deep into the soil of ancient Britain. Long before Christianity, Celtic tribes revered the owl as a guardian of the underworld. It was a symbol of transition, the bridge between life and death. Warriors believed that when they fell in battle, the owl would guide their souls to the next realm. It was not always a creature of evil, but one of passage and protection. Then came the Middle Ages, when darkness and superstition grew thick across Europe. Christianity reframed old symbols into moral lessons. The owl, once a wise guardian, became a figure of dread. Because it hunted at night, a time associated with sin and secrecy, it was said to consort with witches and demons. Church manuscripts from the 13th century show owls drawn beside coffins, candles, and devils. The message was clear: to hear the owl's cry was to be marked by death. In the countryside, belief hardened into ritual. Farmers would hang dead owls above their barns to ward off evil spirits. Some would nail the wings to doors, convinced it protected their family from plague or bad luck. The irony was cruel. They feared the bird because it warned them of death, and in killing it, they fulfilled their own prophecy. And yet, the more people tried to silence the owl, the more its legend grew. In Devon and Cornwall, stories tell of men who mocked the superstition, only to fall ill days later after hearing the cry. One tale from Somerset describes a young bride who heard an owl screech outside her window the night before her wedding. The next morning, her groom was found dead, struck by lightning in a nearby field. To villagers, the message was unmistakable. The owl had spoken. Even as science advanced, the myth refused to die. In Victorian England, newspapers printed reports of omen owls appearing before disasters. During cholera outbreaks, people claimed to hear the cry in the night before entire households perished. It became a kind of folk record of tragedy, a way for communities to explain the unexplainable. Because when medicine could not save and prayer gave no comfort, the owl at least offered meaning. But the story of the death owl isn't limited to England. Similar beliefs appear around the world. In Ireland, it was called the Screachog Rialige, the graveyard screecher. In Germany, the Todvogel, the death bird. Even in the United States, settlers carried the superstition across the Atlantic. In the Appalachian Mountains, an owl's hoot near a cabin was still taken as a sign that a soul would soon depart. The question remains, why do humans, across time and geography, hear death in a bird's voice? Perhaps because the sound itself is unlike anything else in nature. A barn owl doesn't hoot. It screams, a harsh, shivering wail that pierces the night. It sounds almost human, almost like someone in pain. And our minds, tuned to emotion and empathy, cannot help but respond with fear. Yet for every story of dread, there's another of awe. Some farmers say they find comfort in the owl's presence, a reminder that life and death share the same fields. To them, the owl is not a curse but a witness. It doesn't cause death. It observes it as it always has, long before humans built villages or churches. In that sense, the owl's cry may be the oldest voice of the countryside. A song of the wild that our ancestors once respected, then misunderstood, and finally feared. And maybe, in the stillness of an English night, that sound reminds us of something older than belief itself, the fragile line between the living and the lost. When the night falls over the meadows and the last candle is snuffed out, the world becomes a place of echoes. Footsteps fade, winds settle, and only one voice remains, a long, trembling cry that has crossed 1,000 generations. The cry of the death owl, the sound that reminds us we are never far from mystery. By the late 19th century, England was changing. Railways cut through the countryside. Gas lamps glowed in the streets. Science was replacing superstition. And yet, in the quiet rural corners, where the mist still rose and the hedgerows whispered, the old fears remained. In towns, people might scoff at the idea of an owl predicting death. But in villages it was different. There, stories carried weight. A farmer in Yorkshire told of how his father heard an owl cry 3 times before the old man's mother passed away. A woman in Cornwall swore that every time the barn owl screeched near her cottage, within a week, a neighbor would be buried. These were not ghost tales told for fun. They were memories, fragments of truth wrapped in fear, and even science at first struggled to explain it away. Naturalists studying the owl discovered that its haunting call wasn't a hoot at all, but a territorial warning, a sound meant to frighten away rivals or predators. But to villagers, the meaning was already decided. You could explain the physics of sound or the habits of birds, but you couldn't erase the timing, those eerie coincidences when an owl cried and death soon followed. To them, that was proof enough. One man who tried to change the story was Reverend Henry Whitmore, a parish priest from Somerset. In 1889, he wrote an article titled "The Owl's Cry, a Misunderstood Voice," urging people to see the owl as a creature of beauty, not doom. He argued that the barn owl hunted mice in churchyards not because it was drawn to the dead, but because the long grass and stone walls were full of prey. But his reasoning didn't travel far. Villagers still nailed owl feathers above their doors just in case. What's fascinating is how this myth adapted rather than disappeared. In some regions, the owl's death omen became a symbol of protection instead of fear. In Norfolk, people began to believe that hearing an owl meant the danger had already passed, that it warned, rather than cursed. In Wales, farmers started saying that if an owl cried near your house, you should light a candle in every window to confuse the spirits of death. Even the language changed. The owl that cries became the owl that watches. The bird itself, unbothered by human meaning, kept hunting, gliding, and screaming into the night, unaware that it had become a myth woven into England's very soul. Then came the 20th century. Cities grew, electric lights brightened the skies, and superstition faded into curiosity. But the stories didn't vanish, they evolved. In 1962, in a small village in Shropshire, a family reported hearing a piercing owl cry outside their farmhouse one winter night. The next morning, a young boy from the neighboring house was found drowned in the nearby river. The newspapers called it coincidence. The villagers called it fate. Again in 1978, a retired coal miner claimed he saw a pale barn owl perched on his windowsill the night before his brother passed away. "It looked straight at me," he said, like it knew. These stories no longer made headlines, but they continued to pass quietly between people who still believed that nature speaks in signs. Even today, in modern England, that belief hasn't completely disappeared. Wildlife groups often receive messages from locals asking whether a barn owl sighting means anything bad. And if you search social media, you'll find hundreds of posts from people around the world describing the same thing. A strange, sorrowful cry that feels like more than just a sound. Maybe that's the real mystery. It's not about whether the owl predicts death. It's about how deeply humans still crave meaning in the unknown. In every era, in every culture, we look to nature for messages. Some hear comfort in a dove's coo, others warning in a raven's croak, but none seem to strike the human heart quite like the cry of the owl. Across the Atlantic, in the United States, similar tales took root among settlers who carried English folklore with them. In the Appalachian Mountains, where isolation and hardship shaped life, people called it the death bird. When it screamed near a cabin, families would sit awake all night, waiting, praying. In Native American traditions, too, the owl was tied to the spirit world, though not always as a messenger of death. Among the Hopi, the owl was a symbol of sacred knowledge, a keeper of hidden wisdom. Among the Cherokee, it was said that when an owl called your name, it was time to journey to the next world. And that's what makes the myth so powerful. It changes meaning depending on who listens. To one culture, it's a spirit guide. To another, a warning. But always, it is something more than just a bird. It's a reminder that life is fragile, that death is near, that mystery still breathes in the dark corners of our world. Even scientists admit, quietly, that there's something uncanny about the owl's presence, its ability to move silently through the air, its forward-facing eyes that seem almost human, its ghostly feathers that reflect moonlight. Everything about it feels designed for the night, for watching, for knowing. Perhaps that's why we gave it such power. Because it watches us in a world where we see so little. When you stand alone in the countryside at night and an owl screams overhead, the sound is primal. It reaches something deep in the human mind, something older than language, older than reason. It's not fear of the bird itself, but fear of what the darkness hides. Maybe that's why the story of the owl that cried before death still survives. Not because it's literally true, but because it represents the feeling we all know. The sudden chill, the quiet dread, the sense that something unseen moves just beyond the light. In truth, the owl doesn't bring death, but it does remind us of it. And in that way, maybe the legend has always been right. The owl's cry does come before death, not as a curse but as a reminder. A whisper that nothing in this world lasts forever. In the stillness of an English night, the fields lie empty, the stars fade, and a pale shape glides silently across the sky. You might not see it, but you'll hear it. A cry that cuts through the darkness, older than memory itself. And maybe, just maybe, the owl still watches from the shadows. When you listen to the old stories of England, they sound like echoes from another world. A world where the night was not just darkness, but a living thing. Where every sound meant something. And where the cry of an owl could make even the bravest man stop and listen. Today, most people don't live in that kind of darkness anymore. We have streetlights, cars, and glowing screens that follow us into the night. But the owl is still there, unseen, silent, watching. The same bird, the same cry, that frightened our ancestors still glides over our fields and rooftops. Only now we don't hear it as often. Maybe that's why, when we do, it feels so strange. There's something haunting about a creature that has stayed the same while the world around it changed completely. Scientists have studied owls for decades. Their silent flight, their incredible hearing, their eerie call. They can tell us exactly how the sound travels, why it echoes, what purpose it serves, but they can't explain why it feels the way it does. That quiet chill that moves through you when you hear it, the stillness that follows. Perhaps that's the part of us that science can't reach, the part that still remembers the old world when we lived closer to the wild. When we believed that every whisper of wind carried meaning, and that animals were messengers, not mysteries. The owl's cry may not foretell death, but it still reminds us that nature is not separate from us. It speaks in ways we've forgotten how to hear. If you ask people in the English countryside today about the death owl, you'll hear two kinds of answers. Some will smile and say, "It's just an old tale, nothing more." Others will pause, look away, and say softly, "Maybe so. But I wouldn't want to hear one outside my window." And that's the truth of folklore. It never really dies. It hides in the spaces between logic and emotion. We know it's a story, but still we feel it. It connects us to those who came before. The shepherd who whispered a prayer in the dark. The widow who lit a candle after hearing a cry. The child who stared out into the night wondering if the owl was watching them. These are the invisible threads that tie past and present together. The story of the death owl is not really about death. It's about how humans deal with it. How we search for signs in the silence, for messages in the wind. How we turn fear into meaning, and meaning into stories that last longer than we do. Every generation has added to this tale, shaping it to fit their time. And maybe that's why it still survives. Because death, mystery, and wonder never go out of fashion. But there's another way to hear the owl. Not as a messenger of endings, but as a guardian of truth. Across cultures, owls have always been symbols of wisdom. The ancient Greeks saw the owl as the companion of Athena, goddess of knowledge. In Native American traditions, some tribes believed the owl carried sacred understanding between the worlds. In Japan, the owl is a charm of good luck. Even in England, where fear once ruled, the owl's image now appears on coins, books, and school crests. We have, in a way, made peace with the night. Still, the old legends whisper through. In 2004, a wildlife rescue center in Lincolnshire reported a strange incident. A family called them after a barn owl landed on their roof and cried for nearly 10 minutes. The next day, their elderly grandmother passed away peacefully in her sleep. The rescuers, of course, said it was coincidence. But when asked how they felt hearing it, one of them paused and said, "I'll admit, it made me cold for a second." That's the power of old stories. They make even the rational heart hesitate. Maybe the owl never cried for death. Maybe it cried for change, for the endless rhythm of nature that keeps turning, whether we understand it or not. The birth, the decay, the silence. To fear that sound is to fear life itself, because every cry, every whisper in the dark, is part of the same circle. When you think about it that way, the owl becomes something else entirely. Not a symbol of death, but of awareness. It reminds us to stop, to listen, to notice what we've stopped paying attention to. The soft rustle in the grass, the beating of wings overhead, the way time slows down at night, as if the world is holding its breath. And maybe that's what the people of Old England were really hearing. Not a prophecy, not a curse, but the voice of the wild reminding them of their place in it. A sound that doesn't mean fear, but truth. The truth that life is fleeting, and that mystery is all around us, waiting to be heard. If you ever find yourself walking through the English countryside on a foggy night, and you hear that long, trembling cry in the distance, don't be afraid. Stop and listen. Because you're hearing something ancient, something older than stories, older than names, older even than fear itself. You're hearing the sound of time. The same cry that echoed across the moors 1,000 years ago, and will echo 1,000 years from now. And when it fades into silence, you might feel a strange calm. Because in that moment, you'll realize that the owl never warned of death. It only reminded us of life, fragile, fleeting, and forever connected to the night. The owl has never been the enemy. It is the watcher, the witness, the keeper of the world's oldest secrets, and maybe, somewhere in the distance, under the quiet English moon, it still watches from the shadows.